And let's understand what is a final keyword in Java, where we can apply this final thing and what it does actually in our programming language. So in Java, these are the three key elements: variables, methods, and classes. And in variables, we have a different varieties like instance variable, static variables, and local variables. Instance variable, basically a variable which we can access through object. For static variables, we don't have to create an object. We can access directly using class name, and inside method, if we are declaring any variable, so that will be a local to that method, right? And if you talk about method, so method is also having a static and non-static method, and similarly for classes as well. So for those who is getting confused with the static classes, so you might be having an idea about inner class, a class which is defined inside the class, so that we call as a nested inner class. That inner class we can define as an static. And if you observe while programming, so sometimes it happens that once you assign any value to a variable, then you don't want to change that variable later on, right? And same case with the method. Once you have implemented any method, then you don't want others to change it later on. Similarly, if you have designed a concrete class, so there's no point of changing that class as well. So if you wanted to prevent such kind of actions, so that we can do it through final keyword. So final we can use with a variable, with the method, and with the classes. So let's dig more into these definitions starting from final variable. So having said that, once we declare and assign any value to that final variable, then later on we cannot reassign. So let's understand this, why we cannot reassign through coding. So let's get back to our code editor. This is our main class, and now let's start with the final instance variable. Let's understand that what is the final instance variable and how to declare and initialize that. So for that, let's create one class called test, and inside that let me define one variable in type, and I'm assigning some value, let's say 5. And here I am defining one method which will display the value of var. And let me do some operations on this variable. So let's say you have incremented this value right here, and in main method we will create one instance of test, and then we'll call display using that instance variable. So this is very simple example. If you run this, then you can see the value of var will be 6, right? Initially it was 5, but just because of this increment operation it will be 6. So you can see the output over here. So what we have done here is we have created a one instance variable, and the state of that variable is open, means you can read and write on that variable, and that's exactly what we are doing here at line number 11. And this kind of operation, write operation, we can do multiple times on this variable. But in some scenarios you might have that condition that you don't want to give this write privilege. It means once we'll create that variable and once you'll allocate any value in it, after that you are giving privilege to read only, not writing on it, right? So for that, let's define one final here, and then you can see that as soon as you define that instance variable as a final instance variable, then what is happening over here is you can see this error message, which is saying that we cannot assign a value to final variable var. So in this case, this line is illegal, so we have to remove this line. And if you execute this, then you can see the value of var is 5. So this is fine because we are only reading from this variable var, right? And let's assume if you will not initialize here, then what will happen? It will give error message saying that this variable might have not been initialized. So as soon as you declare any variable as a final variable, then the first thing first you have to do, you have to initialize that variable, right? So there are 3 ways to initialize any final variable. One way you have seen just now, and another way is we can initialize that variable inside initializer block. So we can do this. If you run this, then you can see value of var is 10 in the output. And third way is you can initialize inside constructor. So this is also fine, right? And let's say if you have not assigned a value any of this places, and if you try to assign value over here, so this we cannot do. So this display method, which is a instance method, so how we call this, through object, right? So as soon as you create an object, and if that object contains any final variable, then that time itself that variable should have some value in it. If it is not there, then later on we cannot assign it. So that's why we cannot initialize any final variable inside any method. So this is illegal. And if you talk about static final variable, to make any final variable as in static final variable, then we have to write static. So here we can initialize this static variable in two ways only. One way is this. Then if you execute this, then you will see a value of var is 10, right? And another way is, if you're not defining here, then we can use a static initializer block. Inside this, we can assign value to var. And let's talk about local variables. So let's say if we have one local variable called x, right? And if you are defining this local variable as in final, then here you can see that when we created this local variable, then that time we didn't assign any value in it, but later on we can do that. Okay, so this is fine. If you will print this value, so value of x will be 100. And now it has been initialized. So if you do any operation like this increment operation, it will say that we cannot do that. And now by this time you must have a clear understanding of what is a final variable, right? Now the question is how to decide when we need to declare our variable as a final variable, or else when to create a static variable and make it as in final. So instead of taking this random example, let's create one real-time scenario. So in this scenario, we have let's say one ball of mass m, which is kept above ground. This is ground, of height h. And what is our objective is, we need to calculate potential energy of this scenario. And as you know that potential energy would be in this case is mgh, right, where m is a mass and h is a height and g is of course gravity. So let me call this class energy class. So to calculate potential energy, we need to have three variables. So let's make them private. So one variable is mass. For easy calculation, we are defining those variable as an int, private int gravity. So for simplicity, we are taking gravity value as 10, but in real the value of gravity will be a 9.8. And the last one is height. And now the time to create one object. So while creating an object, we will pass value of m and height. So let's say if mass is 11 kg and height is 5 meter. If that is the case, then we have to define parameterized constructor over here. And we will assign those value to respective variables. So as gravity value will not change, so we can assign that value inside the constructor. So in this case, we can define this variable as in final. And what we'll do while creating that variable, we'll assign value 10 in it. And what if I will create two more instance of energy type, and let's say if mass is 12 and height is 15 for second instance, and for third, let's say it is 100 and 115. So here we have created three objects, right? obj, obj2 and obj3, and every object have a one copy of gravity which is constant, right? So this also have gravity variables of 10, this also have gravity 10, and this also have a constant gravity. And now you will see that if any variable is constant through across the object of the same type, then what we can do, instead of having a separate copy, we'll create that variable somewhere else, right? Let's say we have created this gravity over here, and now instead of having this one, this will share this copy. Okay, so how we can do that is very simple. We have to make this gravity as in static. So if any variable is not part of the object, then it has to be a part of class, and that we can do through static keyword, right? So now we have to optimize our code little bit more. Now what we'll do, we will define this variable as in static as well. So now our gravity will be static final variable. And one last point to remember, whenever we have any constant variable, so for those variable, we normally define variables name in capital letters. So we'll change this from small to capital. So it will be gravity. Okay, so far we are done with the final variable, and now let's talk about final method. So final method is a method whose implementation we cannot change once we defined it. So if you think how we can change the implementation of the method, so that is possible only if the class where that method has been defined, if that class we will extend, which we call as a subclass or child class or derived class, inside those class we can change the implementation of the method which is defined inside the base class. And of course, if the access modifier of those method is public or protected. So normally we call this scenario as in method overriding, right? That means in final method we cannot override. So let's take an example and understand this. So for time being, let's comment this out, and let's have one base class inside which we have one public method. Let's name it foo, whose implementation is we are just printing a message inside base class. And now let's say if we extend this class, then what we can do, we can use same method name with same signature, and here we can change the implementation and we'll make it as an inside derived class. And so if we have created object like this, and if you call foo here, right, then what will be the output? So output will be inside derived class. And now let's assume that if you are the owner of this class, and if you're pretty much confident about your implementation, then whatever the logic you have used to implement this method, that cannot be changed further, then in that case we can define this method as a final with a final keyword. And as soon as you do that, right, you can see this error message, foo cannot override foo in base, right? Overridden method is final. Okay, so ultimately we have to remove this part, but still inside derived class you can access this method. The only thing that you cannot implement it. In the same scenario, if you run this, then output will be inside base class. Let's create this object reference as in derived type, and now let's execute again. Then you will see the same output inside base class, right? And now let's come back to our real-time scenario, and let's remove these two lines. Now let's implement a method which will return potential energy. So for that, let's define one public method. Let's name it potential energy, which will return mass into gravity into height. As we know that there is only one way to calculate potential energy, which we have implemented here. So there is no point of modifying this method later on. Let's say if any another class is extending this class, so we don't want this method to get modified in that derived class, right? So for that, what we'll do, we'll declare this method as in final, like this. Okay, and let's print the value of potential energy here. Let's run this, and now you can see potential energy value is 550. Now we are done with the final method, and now let's understand what is the final class. In class normally happens if we'll extend any class, then in that subclass we can override method, or we can access base class variables, and we can change the value of that variable. That means we are changing the definition of the base class. But if you want any class not to get modified by anyone, then what we can do, we have to define that class as a final class. So remember this, in final class we cannot extend it. So we have this base class and res class, for example. So here we are overriding the base class method foo. But if you don't wanted to extend this base class, then what we have to do, we have to just type final in front of class keyword. And as soon as you do that, then you can see this error message saying we cannot inherit from final base class. So at the compile time only it will throw an error. And now let's see in real time how we can decide which class we have to make it as in final class. So let's delete this, and now let's assume in this example now another requirement has come, where now we have to calculate kinetic energy as well. Let's say X will be given, and when Paul will reach at this point of time, then we have to tell what is the kinetic energy for this ball. So as we know that we can calculate kinetic energy with this formula, half mv square, where v will be the velocity of this ball at this point of time. Okay, so how to calculate v here? So let's recollect our Newton's third equation, which was v square minus u square equal to 2as, right? So where a will be g here in this case, s will be x, and u of course initially it is 0, right? At t equal to 0 we are releasing this ball from here. That means this equation will be v square minus 0 equal to 2gx. So v square equal to 2gx. Okay, so remember this, we are going to use this in our program. And let's assume if that requirement has gone to some different developer, so he will design his class in such a way that it should be smart enough to give both answer, right? If somebody is asking for potential energy from that class, then it has to return the potential energy, and of course it should give value for the kinetic energy as well. So what he will do, he will extend your class, let's name it all energy. So with this your potential energy will be the part of all energy class, and because of calculation does have the value within mass and height variable, and here your mass and height is private, so that means this value will not come to this subclass. So what this developer will do, first thing is it will initialize a constructor, and inside this he will pass height and mass value, and inside this constructor it will call parameterized constructor of energy class. And now we will implement method which will return kinetic energy. So let's name it kinetic energy, and it will have one parameter value x, right? So this x is the distance, and then it will return the value of this expression 1 by 2 into mass. So this mass which has been defined inside the energy, so this is a private to this energy, right? So its subclass will not have access to this mass. So what we'll do, we will declare one member here as in private, and inside this constructor will assign it the value of mass, and then it will be 2 into g. So let's see whether we can have access with this gravity which is inside energy class. So we cannot access energy class gravity, right? Just because this is a private. Once we'll change this private to protected, then we can access easily. But let's assume that you're stubborn enough and you have told them that they cannot make any changes in your class. Then what they have to do, they have to create their own copy of this variable gravity, and they can access from their class reference. Finally, we have to into this with the x. So let's simplify this equation here, just because this 2 and this 2 will get cancelled. So we'll remove this. Okay, and now let's create one instance of all energy. Let's name it E, and we'll print value of kinetic energy here. And let's pass some value of x here. So let's pass 2. And while constructing this instance, we have to pass value of mass and height. So we'll pass mass value as in 11 and height is 5. Now let's run this, and now you can see this kinetic energy value is 220. So let's see what value we'll get if we call potential energy through this instance. We don't have to pass anything over here, so let's delete this and let's execute here. So we'll get the same potential energy, and because of this class is capable enough to print both the value, then normally developer can define this class as a final class. But normally in any good organization, if any such requirement comes, then it will go to developer who has designed a class to calculate potential energy. In that case, what you will do, you will just simply you will define your kinetic energy over here, and you will use your energy class to access gravity over here. And instead of having this instance, you will access your object obj to get the kinetic energy value, right? Now let's run this. So now you got both value in your class, and in this scenario, obviously there will be only two energy, one potential and one kinetic energy, which you have implemented already. So you will make it this class as in final. And now because you have made this class as in final class, right, no one can extend your class. So that means you can remove this final from this method. So that's it, guys. So I hope that you have liked our example, and remember this, when you face this question in the interview, then try to give a real-time example like we have seen just now. So if you like our effort, then please do share this video with your friends, and for the new user, please do subscribe our channel and hit the bell icon to get more video notification like this. So thanks again for watching us, and see you in next video.